I was seated across from him in the boardroom of Velthorn Global Headquarters, my hands folded neatly on the polished mahogany table, when Brian Fields explained, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression, "Jennifer, your financial strategy is outdated after 14 years." The Houston skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a view I'd treasured during innumerable meetings during my time as senior financial controller. "I know," I answered evenly, meeting his gaze and thanking him for the opportunity. My calm response obviously confused him, as his eyebrows furrowed slightly as if he had anticipated protests or tears, but instead I straightened my blazer, collected my notes, and left with my head held high. "My name is Jennifer Lister. I'm 52 years old, and I've worked for 14 years at Velthorn Global, an international logistics company with operations in 37 countries, managing the financial controls. I've survived 2 recessions, 3 CEO changes, and numerous reorganizations. I've created systems that have saved the company millions of dollars and shielded it from financial irregularities, and now I was abruptly fired by a man who had been with our Brian Fields, who had an Ivy League degree, worked at a prestigious consulting firm, and promised revolutionary financial management, arrived at Velthorn with great fanfare less than 3 months ago. The board was impressed by his dazzling presentations and modern approach, but what they missed was what I saw right away: vague inconsistencies in his claims. As I emptied my desk into cardboard boxes, I reflected on my meeting with Elaine Woodward, the head of the audit committee, 2 weeks prior. She had called me to her office after hours, closed the door, and spoken in hushed tones, saying, "We've noticed some unusual patterns in expense reports and contracts." She also made references to previous successes and an alarming willingness to bend accounting protocols. "Approvals from the new CFO's office," she said, slipping a folder across her desk. "Nothing specific yet, but enough to raise concerns, so we'd like you to look into it discreetly." I'd already noticed the discrepancies myself, including large consulting fees to companies that I couldn't verify and travel expenses that didn't match known business trips. After approval, the contract terms changed, and I started organizing everything. When Brian fired me, he didn't realize that I was more than just an old financial controller. I was the one who created Velair's financial control systems, and I was familiar with every digital passage, approval workflow, and audit trail. More importantly, though, I knew exactly what I needed to uncover in order to reveal whatever he was concealing. As I carried my boxes to my car, I've never been one for big emotional outbursts. My father, a math professor, taught me that reason and facts always win out over drama and outbursts. This philosophy has served me well throughout my life, especially in my finance career, where accuracy and facts were crucial. I was furious, but I was determined that Brian Fields had just made the biggest mistake of his career. I arrived home earlier than usual, and my modest 2-bedroom condo welcomed me. I had worked at Velthorn for 14 years, which had allowed me to build a comfortable, if not extravagant, life. My retirement fund was strong, and my mortgage was almost paid off. I could have easily left, found another job, and left Brian Fields to whatever schemes he was planning, but that wasn't who I was. After pouring myself a glass of Cabernet, I took a seat at my dining table and laid out the documents I had been secretly gathering over the previous few weeks. Before leaving the office, I had emailed myself important reports that I knew would be pertinent. Nothing private because I was too moral for that, just publicly accessible data that, when interpreted correctly, revealed a damning story. My phone buzzed with Elaine's text message when I heard the news call, so I called Jennifer right away. "I'm shocked," she said when she answered. "This came out of nowhere." "Not entirely," I replied. "Brian's been pushing me out since he arrived, but I didn't expect it to happen so suddenly. The timing is suspicious given what we discussed." "Have you found anything?" "Concrete not yet, but I'm getting close. I've noticed trends in the consulting agreements with Meridian Bay Holdings. The company is legitimate on paper, but I can't find any proof of services rendered that are alarming, but not enough for the board to take action." "Give me 2 weeks, I said, acknowledging that I might not have direct access to the systems anymore, but I've met people who do, and I know exactly what. After we hung up, I spent the evening planning my strategy. I made a thorough timeline of Brian's actions since his arrival, noting any financial activities that coincided with it. I listed important employees who could offer insights without jeopardizing their positions. I also found outside sources that could confirm my suspicions. The following morning, rather than going to the office as I had done for 14 years, I set my laptop, notepads, and financial documents were all over my dining table. I had contacts in the Houston financial industry who respected me and my work. So it was time to call in some favors. By noon, I had spoken with 3 former coworkers who were now employed by the banks that handled Valorne's accounts. They were unable to provide specifics, but their cautious hints validated my. After a week of my investigation, I had a surprise visitor, Thomas Wright Valaire's IT director, who rang my doorbell at 8 p.m. unannounced. He said nervously, adjusting his glasses. But I couldn't risk speaking through company channels because I had suspicions something wasn't right with the new financial arrangements Brian had set up. Things have been strange since you left, Thomas confided in a low voice, even though we were alone in my condo. Brian's brought in a new IT security team. They've modified access protocols to the financial systems. Even I don't have full visibility anymore. That's unusual, I said, maintaining my tone. I wanted to let you know that yesterday was the setback I had been expecting. Neutral even as alarm bells rang in my mind. There's more, Thomas added. I was asked to retrieve all emails between you and the audit committee dating back 6 months. I had to comply officially, but he reached into his messenger bag and handed me a flash drive. Brian, I sincerely told Thomas, thank you for taking this risk. After he left, I plugged in the drive and looked through its contents, and Thomas had included not only the emails Brian was looking for but also internal documents. He was probably hiding his tracks because he realized the audit committee had concerns, so it made perfect sense to fire me when he found out I was investigating his activities. The following morning, I was dealt another blow when system logs revealed weird access patterns. Big financial data transfers were taking place at strange hours with approval shortcuts that I had never approved when I designed the system. My longtime aide Vanessa called in tears. She sobbed as Brian informed her, Jennifer, they're saying horrible things about you, department. You were being investigated for financial irregularities prior to your departure, which led to your termination. I experienced my first real outburst of rage since my termination, as his attack on my reputation went too far. What exactly did he say, Vanessa? You had been tampering with vendor contracts for years, and you had set up a system with backdoors that only you knew the business. Might I need you to do something for me, Vanessa? I said, I need the current Henderson contract, the one Brian renegotiated last month. That's above my clearance now. Brian had made a critical mistake by publicly attacking me, giving me justification to defend myself. I had to restate earnings because of your methods. It was a cunning move on his part to discredit me before I could expose him. Whispered, check the archive system. I recommended that the original should have been logged before the changes were made, and that afternoon Vanessa sent me the proof I needed to show that, following board approval, the terms of the contract had been significantly changed, shifting millions of dollars in fees to consulting firms with ambiguous deliverables that I now firmly believed were associated with Brian. I forwarded the evidence to Elaine. She responded quickly, come to my home office tonight, bring everything you have. Elaine's Tudor-style home was located in one of Houston's more established neighborhoods, and her home office reflected her personality. It was meticulously traditional yet completely modern where it mattered. A number of monitors showed financial data, and the walls were lined with antique bookshelves. The board is splitting on this. As we went over my evidence, she clarified the problem. Half of the group views Brian as the creative force Valaire needs in the face of shifting market conditions, while the other half is worried but wants hard evidence before opposing the CEO's hand-picked CFO. I argued that this isn't just about creative versus traditional approaches, citing the contract discrepancies. These changes weren't approved by The board, but they produced an extra $2. Elaine nodded slowly, saying, "It's suspicious, but we need to establish a direct connection to Brian." I pulled up the corporate registration documents and said, "I think I know how." I responded. The beneficiary companies, Meridian Bay Holdings and Falcrest Advisors, have almost no online presence or verifiable business activities. Acquired. Through my contacts in the industry, both businesses were registered 6 months ago by the same law firm, which also represents Axington Partners. Elaine, Brian's former employer, saw her eyes narrow precisely, and when we looked at the authorized signatories, I brought up another document that highlighted the name Patricia Fields. We're talking about possible fraud, conflicts of interest, and money misappropriation, which is why he needed me to leave. I verified that his wife uses her maiden name professionally, but I discovered their marriage announcement from 8 years ago. Elaine leaned back in her chair, taking in the implications. "This is getting serious, Jennifer." Elaine smiled, the first smile I'd seen from her in weeks, and we spent the next 3 hours constructing a thorough case. The pattern was obvious. Brian had been systematically allocating Velthorn funds to businesses connected to himself. As a financial controller, I would eventually question these transactions during routine audits. He knew that, but he didn't anticipate that we'd already asked you to look into his activities. Conservative estimates place the sum under the pretext of genuine consulting services at about $4.5 million in just 3 months. As I drove home that evening, I felt cautiously optimistic because the evidence was strong, but corporate politics were complicated. Brian had supporters on the board, especially those who had pushed for his employment, and they wouldn't simply desert him. At 6 a.m., the phone rang. My gut nodded when Vanessa spoke to me the following morning in a quiet, concerned tone. "Jennifer, something odd is happening. A team from an outside accounting company arrived this morning and is going over all of the financial records from the previous 5 years of your employment as controller. Went on the offensive in an attempt to find or fabricate evidence of irregularities during my leadership," escalating his defense. "Did they say who authorized the audit?" I asked Brian. "Who said it was the board's directive," but she hesitated. What Vanessa heard him say on the phone earlier, though, was, "They're not finding anything useful yet, but keep digging, we need something concrete." The only possible outcome of the emergency board meeting was that Elaine had presented our evidence to important board members, who were taking it seriously. Brian was frantically trying to deflect attention and discredit me before he lost control of the story. "Thank you, Vanessa. Please be careful and don't get caught assisting me." The next 48 hours played out like a high-stakes chess match as Brian made his move by calling an impromptu press conference to announce a modernization of Velthorn's outdated financial systems and hint at concerning discoveries about previous practices. Although he never specifically mentioned me, it was obvious to anyone familiar with the company that I was the real professional. Observing the live stream from my dining room table, I noticed that his confidence seemed forced and that his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was afraid, and my phone was buzzing nonstop with messages from old coworkers and contacts in the industry, many of whom were outraged by the thinly veiled accusations. I replied politely but said little, saying that now wasn't the time for a public argument. Bolstering our argument, a former classmate who is currently employed by the Securities and Exchange Commission shared insights about what would be conclusive proof of financial misconduct without breaking any rules. Equipped with this information, I improved my strategy by concentrating on recording the money flow from Velthorn to the shell companies and, eventually, to Brian. The breakthrough came as a surprise. I discovered a pattern of weekend trips to Austin while looking over Brian's travel expenses. The company had paid for opulent hotel stays, claiming they were for possible investor meetings, but comparing Velthorn's investor relations calendar with the missing piece, a social media search showed that Patricia Fields had opened an art gallery in Austin 3 months prior. When I looked more closely, I found that the gallery's business filing identified Meridian Bay Holdings as its primary financial backer, the same shell company that Velthorn was paying consulting fees to, and that Brian was standing proudly next to his wife in the grand opening photos, the same weekend he claimed to be meeting investors at Velour's expense. I sent the evidence right away. Elaine replied with a one-line emergency board meeting postponed until tomorrow at 9 a.m. That evening, I had another surprise guest, Gregory Patel-Valair, General Counsel, who stood at my door and appeared uneasy, asking if I might enter. Jennifer. I hesitated. Gregory, he said formally. I understand your concern, he added, observing my hesitancy, but I'm here on official business. The board has requested your presence at tomorrow's meeting. He reported directly to the CEO and had always been politically astute, but his allegiances were uncertain. What makes the board want me to be there? I inquired. Still hasn't invited him in because of the significant accusations made by the audit committee. All parties interested should speak directly to the board. After he departed, I called Elaine, who said, he handed me an official letter. This is a formal invitation, not a subpoena, but I strongly advise you to attend. Confirmed that the invitation was valid. It wasn't my idea, she acknowledged. Several board members insisted on hearing your perspective directly. Brian will be there too. He'll come prepared to discredit me, I said. Then you'd better be more prepared, she said simply. I spent the night compiling my evidence into an understandable and persuasive presentation. As dawn broke, I mentally prepared myself for the confrontation by focusing on the facts and avoiding accusations or emotional appeals. I chose a charcoal suit that exuded authority without being ostentatious, and I went over my notes one last time before security escorted me up to the executive floor at Valhorn headquarters, where I had spent standing outside the boardroom doors. I took a deep breath. In a few minutes, I would face the man who had attempted to ruin my reputation and career, but unlike Brian Fields, I had truth on my side. The boardroom fell silent as I passed the familiar faces that had looked at me for countless hours over 14 years with a mixture of sympathy, curiosity, and, in some cases, hope. When the board chairman, Harold Thompson, said, "We find ourselves in an unusual situation that requires clarity," I nodded professionally and took the vacant seat directly across from Brian. Elaine at the head of the table and Brian, who appeared to have aged years in the week since he had fired me, were among the 12 board members who turned to face me. Harold went on, "Serious allegations have been raised concerning financial irregularities under Mr. Fields' leadership. Countering allegations have been made suggesting these claims are retaliatory on Ms. Mallister's part after she was fired." Brian leaned forward with a confident smile that faltered as our eyes met for those who haven't been fully briefed. Elaine, the head of the audit committee, firmly interrupted, saying, respectfully, "Chairman, Ms. Mallister's presence here is inappropriate. She is no longer an employee and has shown clear animosity toward Ms. Mallister. I commissioned her investigation before her dismissal, not after I saw several board members exchange surprised glances. It is obvious that Brian had been controlling the narrative. I think it would be beneficial if Ms. Mallister presented her findings directly." Elaine suggested Harold nod, so I connected my laptop to the presentation system and started methodically outlining the evidence. I displayed the fraudulent travel expenses, the money trail to the art gallery, the contract discrepancies, and the shell companies. I also presented the email trail system, logs and financial transfers, each slide building on the one before it to create an unquestionable case. In summary, I came to the conclusion 30 minutes later, about $8 million had been transferred from Velthorn Global to organizations directly associated with Mr. Fields or his family members under the guise of valid business expenses. The room fell silent for a few seconds after I finished Brian's. He finally sputtered, "This is obviously a vindictive attempt to, are you denying that Patricia Fields is your wife? Or that Meridian Bay Holdings funded her gallery? Or that you charged Valair for investor meetings that never occurred?" And his face had been drained of color. A third Brian's eyes darted around. Harold interrupted Mr. Fields and said, "Please wait outside while the board deliberates. You can't possibly be taking her word over mine." Brian objected, saying that she is obviously biased, and Harold reiterated firmly that the room is looking for allies and finding none. These connections are being presented without context, and there are valid business reasons for them. I've seen enough. After Brian left, Harold turned to me, Miss Mallister, and said, "Thank you for your thorough presentation. The board would also like you to step out while we discuss next steps." I gathered my materials and headed toward the door, reaching for the handle, but Harold said, "One more thing, Miss Mallister, the methods you used to." I saw Brian talking urgently with Gregory Patel in the hallway. When he saw me, he interrupted in the middle of his sentence, his face twisted in anger. "You think you've won," he hissed, "but this isn't over." This evidence made me smile a little. "I prefer the term thorough, Chairman Thompson." Several board members laughed, reducing the tension in the room. The board's deliberation lasted almost 2 hours, and I patiently waited in a small conference room reviewing emails on my phone while Brian paced the hallway outside making heated phone calls occasionally. Eventually, Gregory Patel appeared, and I calmly replied, "Have connections you can't imagine." "Unfortunately for you, Mr. Fields, I don't rely on imagination, I rely on evidence." After carefully weighing the evidence, Harold said, "The board has reached several conclusions. First, there is sufficient cause to terminate Mr. Fields' employment with Velair Global effective immediately." Brian began to object, but Harold held up his hand as soon as we entered the boardroom again, but his expression said nothing about their decision. Brian's face flushed deep red. "This is a mistake you'll all regret," Harold said icily. "I have explanations for everything presented today, save them for the investigation. I have notified the appropriate authorities regarding the financial irregularities uncovered, Mr. Fields. I suggest you retain legal counsel promptly." Harold turned to me as Brian was being carried away, saying, "Miss McAllister, the board owes you an apology, and your dismissal was clearly orchestrated to conceal financial misconduct." "Thank you, Chairman," I said professionally, "which brings me to our third conclusion," Harold said. I hadn't anticipated this turn of events. I had been focused on exposing Brian rather than going back to Velour. "The board would like to offer you reinstatement to your position with a significant compensation adjustment to reflect both your loyalty and the apparent increased scope of your responsibilities." Elaine also added, "We'd like to create a new position reporting directly to the audit committee chief." I appreciate the offer, but I said carefully that I'd like some time to think about it. As a compliance officer, you would have independent authority to look into any financial concerns without interference from executives. The offer was compelling because it gave you more authority, direct board access, and protection from future executives who might find my methods too rigorous. 3 weeks later, I returned to Velour Global as the newly appointed Chief Compliance Officer, and my first assignment was to perform a thorough review of all financial records. Harold nodded, "Of course, but I hope you'll agree that Volthorn needs precisely the kind of financial leadership you've demonstrated, thorough, ethical, and seemingly impossible to intimidate." Activities during his brief tenure, the damage was substantial but contained. Brian had acted swiftly but had not yet carried out his larger schemes, and the majority of the money that had been diverted could be recovered through legal action against his shell companies. The press covered Brian's indictment with predictable sensationalism, claiming that Velhorn compliance was one of the CFO's modern methods. 6 months after an officer discovered multi-million-dollar fraud, I was notified that Brian had accepted a plea deal admitting to wire fraud and that I had maintained a low profile, concentrating on improving the company's financial controls rather than publicity. My team grew to include forensic accountants and compliance specialists who shared my dedication to accuracy and transparency. As part of the settlement, Patricia's gallery was seized and liquidated, and he was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and forfeited all assets related to the stolen funds. The day the news broke, Elaine stopped by my office feeling vindicated. She asked, "I never needed vindication," to which I replied, "Honestly, I just needed the truth to come out." Elaine smiled knowingly, "Well, the board is definitely I'm Happy to report that your new compliance framework has already avoided two major control issues that could have led to issues later on. I remarked, your job is outdated, and she teased me. I finally let out a real laugh. You know, I've learned to appreciate that labeling outdated methods like cross-verification documentation and looking back on the experience, I realized that Brian's biggest error wasn't his fraudulent schemes or even specifically targeting me, rather, it was failing to understand where money goes. Elaine said, raising an imaginary toast, I prefer classic. I replied with a smile, like fine wine. And proper accounting. Recognize that honesty in the financial industry is always in vogue, and the techniques he rejected as being out of date were exactly as I create, what brought him down. The new compliance division of Velter frequently consider how occasionally the most effective retaliation isn't about obtaining even so, it's about demonstrating your worth.